I'm an 18-year-old female from the UK. This happened in February of 2019. I was 16 at the time, and I got set up on a semi-blind date. We had seen photos of each other by a mutual friend. The guy was called Cameron, who was 19. Cameron seemed like your average guy, maybe a little into video games and anime and stuff, but overall, nothing my friends told me about him seemed off in any way. Our mutual friend gave us each other's numbers, and we texted for a night, and decided to meet in a Starbucks the next day since we were both free. I never liked to meet new people this soon, but figured since Cameron knew my friend, it couldn't possibly go wrong. How mistaken I was. I arrived slightly early, ordered my coffee since I never liked guys to feel like they have to buy it for me, and parked up a seat facing away from the door, and pulled out a book. I'm there for maybe 15 minutes chilling out when I get a text saying he's here. So I'm like, great, I'm at this table, and I feel a presence over my shoulder, and I turn my head, slightly in acknowledgement. He must be here. Before I even get the chance to squeak a hello, his lips latch onto my neck, and he starts sucking on it. Now, I don't like people touching my neck at the best of times. I'm very ticklish, and I get super uncomfortable by people even touching it. A few times, I've had massages or hair treatments, and I've been holding it in discomfort, and he's latched on like a leech. This man also smelled horrendous, kind of like dust personified. I freak out and elbow his chest to get him the hell off me. He lets go and looks at me with this weird expression on his face, and laughs in deadpan. It's really, really creepy, and I start to become alarmed, and ask him what the hell that was about, and he just said he thought it was cute. I try to have a conversation. I'm like, okay, first impressions don't mean anything. Let's try and give him a chance. He's just creepily staring at my chest. Wow, I didn't know Asians could have boobs like that. I better not let you go. That's a direct quote. You can't make this crap up. I'm distinctly uncomfortable, but I don't want to just run away. He's giving me really weird vibes, so I go into the ladies' bathroom and wait for someone else to come in. I ask her to help me get out undetected. I don't want this man following me home or something like that. She of course agrees and lends me her hat and scarf. It's February in the UK after all, and we come out the bathroom together and she manages to help me sneak out the back door of the Starbucks without him noticing me. He asked my friend where I went, but I told my friend to never mention me again. I was too terrified. I know I probably didn't behave well, I should have just told him I was leaving, but I was honestly so scared. To the guy who decided it was appropriate to suck my neck, before we had even said hello, let's not meet again.
So before this whole lockdown thing happened and my dating life went to hell in a handbasket, I used to swipe through Tinder and Bumble quite a lot, looking for girls to hook up with. So I'm bored in my Silver Lake apartment one day when I come across this absolute smoke show of a girl who was listed under the name Lilith. She had these big green eyes, wore pigtails a lot in her profile pictures, and had absolutely no qualms of showing off this big peachy butt she had. She also had this goth girl vibe going, which was something I find really attractive. I mean, she was definitely not the kind of girl I'd bring home to mom, but that's not really what I'm looking for when I'm swiping, so naturally, I swipe right. Boom, we match. I think I actually let out this involuntary "no way" when the old "it's a match" text appeared, and kinda cynically told myself, nah, she's a bot, this isn't real. But yup, it was real, and she was so cute to talk to. At first, anyway, because things started to go a little different when we actually met up. She worked at this coffee shop at the Getty and asked me if I wanted to pick her up after her shift so she could take me somewhere real special, which turned out to be the Museum of Death on Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, not my ideally romantic place to go on a first date, but like I said, she was a slam piece, and it was basically impossible to say no to her. So it was decided, and after I picked her up, she kept it a mystery for a while, only telling me to drive her to Hollywood Boulevard before revealing where she actually wanted to go. The area around the museum is kind of sketchy, but again, I'd have driven through way worse neighborhoods for a date with this girl, so I just pushed all my concerns to the back of my mind. Despite the interior being as dark and dingy as it was, looking like an over-clustered basement, the whole thing was actually kind of interesting at first. But I'd be lying if I said my eyes stayed on the exhibits the whole time, when they were pretty much glued to her butt whenever I wasn't going to get caught looking. It most definitely wasn't particularly creepy either, but the things that Lilith started to say to me as we were walking around the place did in a big, bad way too. Like I said, the exhibits were interesting, but that's all they were aside from being gross and spooky. There were death masks, body parts preserved in formaldehyde, all the things you might come to expect from a place called the Museum of Death, and then some. But this Lilith chick starts saying how pretty some of this stuff is, looking at it the way any other girl might look at a picture of a puppy or something. She then starts asking me all these weird questions about how I'd like to die. Yeah, how I'd like to die. I tell her I wouldn't like to die at all. I mean, it was legit the creepiest question I think I'd ever been asked, and she insists that everyone has a way they'd most want to die. I don't want to screw up the date or anything. She seemed crazy, and crazy girls can be real fun, if you catch my meaning, so I give her some throwaway response like, whatever way is most pain-free. She starts telling me how that was a boring answer and how she'd like to die of hypothermia because it apparently makes you feel all warm and sleepy towards the end. How some victims of hypothermia have even taken their clothes off before they died and just laid down in the snow or whatever before their heart stops beating. She also then gave me this long, in-depth speech about how taking another person's life would be better than even getting intimate, if you catch my drift. How that feeling of pure power must dwarf any feeling that drugs or alcohol have to offer. She then tells me how hot she thought it would be to watch me drown at the bottom of a pool while there's an audience and I'm totally naked. How it'd actually turn her on to see my final moments of desperation before my body went limp and floated around the tank. Then something about how the Vikings would make wings out of the skin on a person's back by peeling it off and spreading it out, calling it beautiful, how it was like art or something. When she's done telling me all of that, and I'm suitably freaked out, she starts calling me pet, and how she wanted me chained up at the end of her bed so she could do whatever she wanted with me. Now, any other girl, I'd think that was incredibly kinky, but after what Lilith had just talked about, I really didn't think what she had in mind for me involved any kind of pleasure whatsoever. When it came to driving her home, she actually told me to stop a few blocks away from her house because she didn't want me to know exactly where it was that she lived at, saying that you couldn't be too careful these days with all the psychos in the world who use dating apps. Yep, she said that to me after she'd spent like an hour talking about all the ways she'd want to die or how she'd watch me die. As soon as I got home, I blocked her number. I've never been more scared of anyone like that before, let alone a girl I wanted to hook up with. So, Lilith, if you're reading this, let's not meet again. A few months back, I decided I was pretty much over the breakup I'd had during the summer with my long-term girlfriend. It took me months to be able to get over it, as I was really heartbroken, but at some point you just sort of have to get back on the horse, don't you? So I downloaded that dating app Hinge and started swiping through profiles. It's definitely the best dating app I've come across, as it lets you actually message girls directly instead of just sort of hoping that they're going to see you and match with you. So it definitely gave me a better chance at getting to talk to the kind of girls I'm into, and one of these was a Persian girl named Sarushe. Sarushe was honestly one of the most beautiful girls I'd ever laid eyes on. She had this big mess of wild dark hair that was dip-dyed blonde towards the ends, really high cheekbones, perfectly sculptured eyebrows, and some of the deepest, darkest, most alluring brown eyes I'd ever seen. She was simply stunning, and because she'd grown up in Tehran, the capital of Iran, I had something of an edge. You see, I speak a little bit of Farsi, the language they speak there, and I figured that might impress her if I told her as much, which it did, and boom. Only an hour or so later, I sent her my opener and we were chatting. She was an extremely busy person, and I was flattered when she said that she would make time to see me. So, we arranged to meet for coffee over the weekend. She showed up to our date in her gym gear and apologized for being so underdressed, but could only make it after a scheduled workout with a personal trainer. But I didn't care at all. She looked absolutely smoking hot in her yoga pants. And we were having coffee, just kind of chatting about our lives, our interests, all that first date kind of stuff, when I look out of the big glass windows to see this dude leaning up against his car. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me at first, but after a minute or two I realized that he was just straight up staring at us. At one point, Sarushe noticed me looking over her shoulder and asked what I'm looking at, and I make a comment about the bloke outside who seemed to be proper eyeballing us. She then turns around, looking over her shoulder, then spins back with this terrified look on her face before saying something like, we have to leave, now. I'm all like, why? Do you know that fella? And she denies knowing him, but I'm not a dope. I knew what the score was, like straight away. Either it was a controlling family member or something, or it was a psycho ex-boyfriend. I figured all he'd do was follow us to try and be intimidating or something, but I never imagined he'd actually lay hands on me, and the way that he did it absolutely scared the soil out of me. You see, where I live is built up along this big mile-wide river, and the coffee shop me and Sarushe had chosen to meet at was right on the docks. So we're walking along the city's promenade when the guy cornered me, grabbed me by the throat, and started pushing me backwards so my back was leaning over the rails. I tried to get him off, but this bloke was an absolute unit, and as much as I tried, there was no getting him off of me. And the thing about the river where I live is that it's got a really, really strong current. Like if you fall off of a boat or over the side of the prom, you can be in serious trouble as the current will suck you under the water, drown you, and then just drag you out into the Irish Sea. So the whole time he's threatening me, telling me to leave Sarushe alone, all this big macho masculine stuff. Sarushe is smacking him around the head, telling him to get off me, and all the while I'm thinking, if I go over the edge here, I'm a dead man. And I don't think he had any idea of it either. Like it didn't sound like he was from our city, as we have a very particular accent, which he just didn't have. So he was probably thinking he could lash me in the water and embarrass me a wee bit, and I'd just be fine, but I'm telling you now, I wouldn't have been, and he'd have been done for manslaughter. But thank God, he didn't throw me over the railings, he just sort of backed off and headed back the way that he'd come after he'd blown off a little bit of steam. I mean, the girl was gorgeous. I don't blame him for being a bit sore after a breakup or jealous of another lad, but Jesus Christ, if he'd been angrier, if he'd have lost his cool, really lost control, I legit wouldn't be here typing this. I'd be floating in the Irish Sea somewhere, maybe washing up as a rotten corpse on the beach in County Cork, all because of some idiot getting a bit jealous. I live in a place called Dark Hollow, about 20 minutes outside of Pittsburgh. It's a really nice neighborhood, really leafy and green with some really nice old houses, and I won't deny that I've been immensely privileged to have grown up there. But at the same time, there was a huge downside to living there too, and that came in the form of the Ward family. The Wards were an absolute nightmare to live near to, and they made pretty much every other family's lives unbearable at some point for a variety of different reasons. Individually, they were bad enough, but collectively, they were like a horror movie level of nightmarish. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some budding horror filmmaker who writes or directs the next Hereditary, and it all comes out that it was inspired by the Wards. The patriarch of the family was named Winston, or Win for short, but being one of Win's neighbors was nothing short of a serious loss. Now, for reference, I had most of my encounters with Win when I was a teenager, and being a girl, Win always took a certain liking to me that he just didn't show to other people. He was always sickeningly polite with me, the kind of polite that verged on weirdly flirtatious. To other people, It probably just seemed like he was overly nice, maybe a little socially awkward. But being alone with Wynn, or in situations where there weren't close observers, that was a different situation entirely. There were a handful of occasions where I caught Wynn looking at me in a way that made my skin crawl. He had a hunger in his eyes, like this beastly, ravenous look, like he wanted to eat me alive. His eyes would glaze over and his lips would curl up ever so slightly in this horrifically perverted way that always made me feel stupidly uncomfortable. There was one time when I bumped into him in a convenience store near to downtown Pittsburgh. After he said hi and made a little small talk, he seemed to follow me around the store for a little while. He acted all innocent, making out like he was just browsing stuff in the aisles, but at some point, he got way too close to me. I think I was just too nervous to actually do anything about it. I didn't want to make a scene or cause any unnecessary conflict. After all, what would I tell people? Mr. Ward stood near me in a store? Anyways, when he was standing close to me, I heard him sniffing the air, like taking these big inhalations of breath through his nose, almost like he was trying to smell me. I couldn't walk away fast enough, and in the end, I left the store without even picking up what I went in there to buy. Like I said, he was overly nice to girls and women, but an absolute monster to any boys or men who happened to catch him in the wrong mood. He once ran out of the house with a baseball bat when my big brother used their driveway to turn around once. And the way he told it, if he hadn't driven away as fast as he could, Mr. Ward probably would have done some damage to his car. Then there was his wife, Maggie. Maggie always wore way too much makeup. I mean, so much it looked really jarring, and she plucked her eyebrows really thin. I'm pretty sure she was a good few years younger than Wynn, but the way she made herself up made it seem like she was 20 or 30 years older and was just trying to look younger. Maggie was famous for sitting out on their porch and knitting, which I think contributed to the whole old person vibe she gave off. Only she didn't really ever seem to be knitting anything. I remember walking our dog around the neighborhood and getting a look at the tangled mess of yarn she just seemed to be poking needles into. It was like a lime green spider web, just a tangle of thread she stared at like she was in some kind of trance. She also had this talent for turning super happy sounding innocent nursery rhymes into the creepiest sounding things, singing them all slow and deliberate in a sing-song voice that sounded like a combination of a creaking door and nails on a chalkboard. I remember one time when we got some of their mail delivered to our house by mistake, and my mom made me go over to drop it off. Mrs. Ward was sitting on their porch, poking these dirty-looking knitting needles into a tangle of yarn and singing, "Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." When she looked up to see me standing there with the mail in my hand, she acted all scared, which was nuts because I think I was way more freaked out to be over there. But she thanked me for bringing the mail over anyway. Yet before I turned to leave, she asked me if I knew a nursery rhyme she was singing. I nodded, and she asked if I knew what the origins were. I said no. And she went on to explain to me that the song had its roots in some old plague that had swept across England. I think she meant the Black Death, but I can't be certain. She said the ring around the rosy part was a reference to a rash that was a symptom of the disease, and a posy was a collection of herbs that was carried to mask the scent of rot that the dying people were said to have given off. Then she tells me that the all fall down part was a reference to people dying from the plague. I don't know how true any of that is, but Jesus, it freaked me out to have her tell me that in her weird scratchy voice with her face all painted up like some circus clown. Their younger son, Jacob Ward, was a total freak. He was obsessed with Native American culture, which I'm not saying is a bad thing at all, but Jacob was totally toxic about it. It was rare that you'd see that kid and he didn't have his face painted or have this grim homemade headdress on or whatever. He also liked to run around with a bow and arrow that his parents insisted was totally harmless and use those cartoony sucker tip arrows. But there are a lot of people, myself included, that swear that they'd seen him using actual sharp-tip arrows on a handful of occasions. He'd aim them at you, pull the drawstring back to the point that you'd actually run for cover, but he never seemed to fire any, and you could never catch him using them whenever there were any grown-ups around. They actually got a social worker called over at some point because a few people had seen Jacob walking around with dead squirrels or pigeons. I'm not sure if he'd shoot them himself with his bow and arrow or they were just roadkill or something, but it was alarmingly enough to enough people that they actually had a visit from someone. Although whether or not that actually came to anything, I don't know. Then finally, their older son was this kid named Johnny. Johnny was the kind of kid that growled at people in high school when they got too close to him, and before he got expelled for fighting, did something seriously messed up. Apparently he asked this girl to go out on a date, some super pretty but super nerdy girl who happened to be his lab partner. She says no, and Johnny doesn't take it very well at all. He made things difficult for her during chemistry by not talking or looking at her, and eventually she had to basically beg the teacher to switch partners so she could even get a passing grade. Not long after, she was driving back from school in her seemingly empty car when she looks in the rearview mirror to see Johnny just sitting in her back seat, grinning at her. He'd apparently broken into her car and hidden in the footwell in her back seat under some blankets or something, or at least that's what we all figured he'd done. She was so scared she crashed her car and had to spend a week in the hospital. All Johnny got was a visit from the cops and a warning to stay away from her, and somehow it was all just blamed on teenage hijinks. I think maybe because the girl's family were too scared of the wards to press charges or whatever. I'm sure there's more to that story, but that's all I know of that. When the for sale sign finally showed up from the ward's house, I think Dark Hollow was about ready to throw a big party to celebrate them leaving, and after they did, they became something of an urban legend, basically a campfire tale that only a handful of people really knew was actually true and not something we made up to scare people. Like, I still think it's a miracle that there wasn't any bigger drama to happen involving the wards, something like a murder or whatever, little Jacob shooting someone with an actual arrow. I know Johnny basically almost killed his lab partner in that car crash, but somehow they never actually went through with seriously hurting anyone. But who knows, maybe a couple more years and there would have been a fatality. And who knows what they've been up to, wherever they moved to. Maybe it's only a matter of time before they seriously hurt someone.